the 1950s, Hollywood had a system, a machine. And when its most perfect product, Grace Kelly, abandoned her Hollywood throne for a real one in Monaco, that machine panicked. A void had opened, and a desperate search began for the second Grace. They thought they found her. Her name was Lee Remick. On paper, she was a perfect copy, a New England aristocrat, a debutante educated at the most exclusive schools. She had impossible blue eyes and a poise that defined class. The studio had found its replacement princess, ready to be polished and placed in a gilded cage. But they had made a profound, fatal miscalculation. They looked at the pristine patrician surface and completely missed the inferno raging beneath. They thought they had found a block of ice. They had, in fact, found a bonfire. This is the story of the first and only Lee Remick, a woman whose raw human talent was too honest to be contained by the perfection she embodied. The source of that conflict, the very blueprint for her tragedy, lies in the world that built her. Lee Remick was born in Quincy, Massachusetts on December 14, 1935. Her father, Francis Frank Remick, the successful owner of a high-end department store. This was the world of the Boston Brahmin ideal, a world of class, of poise, of unassailable propriety. It was a world where success was measured not just in dollars, but in the quiet, heavy dignity of one's name. Lee was raised to be the perfect lady, but that very perfection would become her prison. This was a world of profound, almost suffocating repression. The Brahmin ideal was one of emotional restraint. You did not make a scene. You did not discuss your private matters. You were witty, you were educated, you were charming, but you were never raw. You were never messy. This was the world that produced the cool blondes, the women who, like Grace Kelly, could suggest a volcano of passion precisely because they showed none of it on the surface. This was the world of her father, Frank. This was the world of a gilded cage, where your class was your armor and your armor was your prison. But then there was the second Boston, the secret one. This was the world of her mother, Gertrude Remick. Gertrude was not a department store heiress. She was an actress. This is the key. This is the rosebud of Lee Remick's life. We must pause here because this one fact explains everything that is to come. In the 1930s, for a woman of Gertrude's social standing, being an actress was not a respectable hobby. It was a defiant, almost scandalous career. It was the absolute antithesis of the Frank Remick world. It was a world of pure, unfiltered public emotion. It was a life dedicated to making a scene, to exploring the very messy human truths that the other Boston was dedicated to hiding. We can only imagine the life Gertrude lived, or the one she wished she had. Was she a brilliant, frustrated talent, a woman who had the spark, but was born in an era that had no use for it beyond the local stage? Did she, in marrying Frank Remick, make the sensible choice, trading the chaotic, uncertain, and thrilling life of the stage for the comfort, stability, and emotional sterility of the department store aristocracy? Lee Remick was forged in the crucible of this domestic Cold War. She grew up as a child of two warring masters, her father's world, which demanded perfection, and her mother's world, which dreamed of performance. Her entire life and career would be a high-wire act trying to balance polish with the urge to explode into something more honest. She would spend her life using that untidy artistic instinct to climb into the safest, most respectable version of success. This psychological cocktail of polished surface over a restless performer's soul is what made her so unique and ultimately so vulnerable. She wasn't just playing a classy woman, she was one. But beneath that flawless, debutante-trained surface, Something much hotter and more unruly was always burning. This wasn't a girl who just fell into acting. This was a girl who was built for it. A girl who, perhaps, needed acting to survive. It was the only place in the world where the two halves of her identity, the Frank and the Gertrude, could coexist. It was the only place she was allowed to be messy, as long as she was classy about it. When Lee was a child, her parents divorced. The perfect Brahmin image had cracked. Frank Remick remained in Massachusetts. Gertrude, in a move that tells you everything you need to know, took her daughter and moved to New York City. She didn't just move to New York, she moved to the heart of the Gilded Cage. Lee was enrolled in Miss Hewitt's classes, an exclusive all-girls finishing school. On the Upper East Side after graduating, she would go on to Barnard College, the prestigious sister school to the all-male Columbia University. Let us be perfectly clear about what these institutions were in the late 1940s and early 1950s. While they offered a first-rate education, their primary unspoken social function was to serve as finishing schools for America's elite daughters. This was the world that Gloria Steinem at Smith College around the same time was so desperately trying to escape. This was the world of the Mrs. Degree. These schools were not by and large trying to create female revolutionaries, CEOs, or political leaders. They were, with breathtaking efficiency, creating the perfect wife. This is where Lee Remick learned the Grace Kelly role. This was her first and most important acting class. She learned more than just history or literature, the true curriculum. How to walk, how to talk, how to dress, how to hold a room with a quiet, demure grace. She learned how to be an interesting but not threatening dinner party companion for a future lawyer from Harvard or a future banker from Yale. She was a debutante. She was formally presented to society. She was, in every sense of the word, a product, a perfect, polished, priceless object designed and built to be the ultimate ornament in a high-powered man's life. This entire system, this polished 1950s finishing school machine, was designed to do one thing: to sand away all the rough edges, to extinguish any unladylike sparks, to finish a girl, which in many ways meant finishing her as an individual. The goal was to become a swan, one of Truman Capote's prized women, whose entire identity was a reflection of her husband's status, her home's perfection, and her own flawless passive beauty. And Lee Remick was, by all accounts, an A-plus student. She was one of the most popular, most beautiful, most perfect girls in her class. The mold was setting. The walls of that carefully curated world were closing in. But her mother's fire, that Gertrude spark, was still there. While Lee was a student at Barnard, living the life of a perfect Upper East Side debutante, she was also secretly living a double life. She was taking the subway downtown to a world that was the absolute polar opposite of Barnard. She was auditioning for plays. In 1953, at just 18 years old, while still a student, she made her Broadway debut in a play called Be Your Age. The play itself was a complete, unmitigated flop. It closed after just 5 performances. But that doesn't matter. The act is what matters, the contradiction. Imagine this. By day, she is Lee Remick, the Barnard intellectual, the debutante, the picture of class. By night, she is Lee Remick, the jobbing actress facing the brutal, neon-lit, rejection-filled world of Broadway. She was living the conflict, her father's world and her mother's world, happening in the same 24-hour period. And what was the Broadway world of the 1950s? It was the dawn of a revolution. This was not the polite drawing room comedy world of her father. This was the world of Marlon Brando, of James Dean, of Montgomery Clift. This was the world of the method. the actor's studio, a new, raw, gritty, and aggressively unclassy form of performance. It was a world that celebrated the mess. It was about mumbles and torn t-shirts and ugly, real, unrepressed emotions. And here, in the middle of this revolution, was Lee Remick. She looked like a swan, but she wanted to play with the method boys. She wasn't, by training, a method actress. She would always be a highly skilled, technical, and brilliant performer. But she was of that generation. She was a patrician with a method soul. She had the class of Grace Kelly, but she had the hunger of James Dean. This was the contradiction. This was the bomb waiting to go off. And in 1956, the year Grace Kelly abdicated her throne, the man who had invented the method revolution, the God King of American theater, Elia Kazan, was looking for a very special kind of dynamite. Elia Kazan was not in the business of casting classy blondes. Kazan was a kingmaker, but he was a kingmaker of a different sort. He was the man who had unleashed Brando in a streetcar named Desire. He had found James Dean for East of Eden. His entire aesthetic, his entire career, was built on finding the raw, wounded outsider soul. He didn't cast swans. He cast the misfits, the rebels, the neurotics. He cast Eva Marie Saint, Julie Harris, Kim Hunter. He cast actors who felt damaged. In 1956, Kazan was embarking on one of his most cynical and savage films, A Face in the Crowd. It was a blistering takedown of American celebrity culture, a story of how a drunken, monstrous folk hero demagogue named Lonesome Rhodes is packaged and sold to the American public by the new terrifying power of television. Kazan needed to cast the role of Betty Lou Fleckham. On the page, Betty Lou is a 17-year-old drum majorette child bride. She is Lonesome Rhodes's first and most disposable groupie. She is, in essence, the human face of the dumb, manipulated, sexually awakened American public that Kazan so despised. He needed a very specific type. He needed an actress who could embody the absolute blinding innocence of 1950s America. But he also needed that innocence to be combined with a raw, almost feral, and deeply unsettling jailbait sensuality. He needed a girl who looked like she belonged on top of a prom night cake, but who behaved like she belonged in a back alley bar. He auditioned hundreds of girls, and in walks Lee Remick. She is 21 years old. She is a Barnard student. She is a New York debutante. She is, in every visible way, the last person on earth who should be playing this role. And Kazan, in a moment of casting genius that would define Remick's entire career, saw past the finish. He looked past the Barnard education and the Miss Hewitt's poise, and he saw the fire. He saw the Gertrude in her. He saw this classy girl, and he understood, with a director's predatory instinct, that the most dangerous woman in the world is the classy one who knows how to use her class as a weapon. He cast her, and in doing so, he lit the fuse. Lee Remick's debut on film is one of the most shocking and electric entrances in American cinema. It is the moment the second Grace Kelly narrative died before it ever truly began. We first see her, not in a Givenchy gown, but in a tiny sequin quasi-military baton twirler outfit. She is leading a high school band, strutting down a dusty Arkansas road. And the strut. It is not a walk, it is a strut. Her hips are swaying with a confidence that is less high school and more burlesque. She meets Lonesome Rhodes. He is a predator, but she is a predator too. She giggles, she bats her eyes. She is the picture of aw shucks innocence, but she is also, with every move of her body, every sly glance, owning the transaction. She is a 17-year-old Lolita, but with a marching band, she is, in a word, hot. And when she performs her talent for the TV show, it's not a polite debutante skill. She twirls her baton, but she also does a split and gyrates and plays to the camera with the savvy of a seasoned vaudevillian. This was 1957. The word bombshell was used for Marilyn Monroe, a woman who was all surface, all vulnerability. This was different. This wasn't a bombshell. This was an incendiary device. The performance is a masterpiece of that patrician performer conflict. It's so shocking because she looks like the classy girl from next door. She weaponizes her innocence. She turns her class into a kind of kink. Kazan had seen the truth. There is nothing more terrifying or more alluring than the perfect girl who wants to be bad-a-face in the crowd, hit theaters, and audiences were floored. So was Hollywood. They had no idea what to do with her. They had been handed this perfect patrician package, and the first thing she does on screen is a sexually precocious baton-twirling routine. The Grace Kelly mold was shattered. Hollywood's response was one of confused panic. They knew they had a star. But what star? They tried to course-correct their solution, as it always was to try and domesticate her fire. They immediately cast her in The Long, Hot Summer in 1958, alongside Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. This was safer. She was a Southern belle, the flirtatious, pretty, but ultimately proper sister-in-law. It was a role designed to put the fire back in the classy box. She was good. She was beautiful. She was classy. She held her own with Newman. The system breathed a sigh of relief. This was the Lee Remick they could sell, the A-face in the crowd thing. That was just an anomaly, a Kazan thing. They had no idea. The anomaly wasn't the fire. The anomaly was the box Lee Remick had arrived. She was a star. She was the second Grace Kelly who had, in her very first performance, shown the world a raw sexual heat that Grace Kelly could only, in her most Hitchcockian moments, imply. The system was now faced with a terrible, wonderful problem. They had this beautiful, classy package, and inside it was a ticking clock, a bonfire of raw human talent that was waiting for the right role, the right match, to burn the entire gilded cage to the ground. That role was coming, and it would make Betty Lou look like a Girl Scout. Hollywood, having been briefly terrified by the Kazan anomaly in A Face in the Crowd, had successfully, or so it thought, re-domesticated Lee Remick. Her follow-up, The Long Hot Summer, had placed her firmly in the flirtatious but proper Southern belle category. The system had, in effect, put her mother's performer fire back inside her father's patrician box. She was beautiful, she was classy, and she was, for the moment, safe. But the system had forgotten a fundamental rule. A true performer, a true artist cannot be contained. They can only be managed. And in 1959, Lee Remick was about to be managed by a man who was, in his own way, even more of a revolutionary than Elia Kazan. His name was Otto Preminger. If Kazan was the high priest of the method, the god of internal psychological truth, Preminger was the ultimate censor breaker. He was a showman, a tyrant, and a brilliant, pragmatic revolutionary who had dedicated his career to waging a public war against Hollywood's production code, the archaic, puritanical set of rules that governed what could be said and shown on screen. Preminger was the man who had released The Moon is Blue without a code seal of approval, a film considered dirty simply because it used the word virgin. He was the man who had made The Man with the Golden Arm, a film that dared to show in graphic detail the realities of heroin addiction. Preminger didn't care about internal truth, he cared about public truth. He loved nothing more than taking a taboo, a private matter that the classy world of the 1950s refused to acknowledge, and plastering it across a 50-foot screen. In 1959, He had found his ultimate weapon, a best-selling bombshell novel called Anatomy of a Murder. The story was, for its time, a cultural grenade. A U.S. Army Lieutenant Frederick Mannion is arrested for the brutal, cold-blooded murder of a local bar owner. His defense? Temporary insanity? The reason? He claims the bar owner had raped his wife, Laura Mannion, just hours before. The entire case and the entire film would hinge on one central, impossible question. Is Laura Mannion telling the truth? This role was the Swan narrative turned inside out. The film wasn't about a perfect victim, a classy lady, like Grace Kelly, who had been wronged and must be avenged. The film was about a lady who was, quite possibly, not a lady at all. Laura Mannion is a puzzle, a creature of pure, frustrating, modern ambiguity. She's beautiful, but she's also too friendly. She's described by the townspeople as a party girl. She loves tight sweaters. She loves running around. She is, in the repressed parlance of the 1950s, a tramp. Or is she? Is she a traumatized victim whose flighty, inappropriate behavior is just a symptom of her shock? Or is she a bored, flirtatious, and manipulative liar who cheated on her husband, got caught, and fabricated a rape story to save her own skin and get her husband off the hook? The entire film, the entire anatomy of this murder depends on her. The audience, the jury, and her own lawyer must decide. And the film, in its most revolutionary move, refuses to give them an answer. Preminger needed an actress who could walk this impossible razor's edge. He needed a woman who could be, believably, both. She had to have the class to make you want to believe her, but the fire to make you doubt her. Who else could it be? Lana Turner, the reigning sweater girl bombshell, was considered, but Turner was all artifice, all performance. You would know she was a bad girl from the moment she walked on screen. Preminger needed the Kazan anomaly. He needed the debutante who could twirl a baton. He needed the classy girl who knew how to be messy. He needed Lee Remick. Her performance in Anatomy of a Murder is not just a role. It is a cultural detonation. It is the single greatest synthesis of the Frank Remick and Gertrude Remick halves of her soul. She takes her father's class and uses it as her mother's weapon. From her very first scene, she destroys every gilded cage expectation. James Stewart's Paul Beegler, the small-town lawyer, goes to meet the raped wife he and we are expecting to find a broken, weeping, hysterical victim, a perfect victim. Instead, he finds Laura Mannion. She's in slacks, a tightish sweater, and sunglasses. She's not crying. She's cool. She's flirty. She's sizing him up. She's a cool cat, a modern woman who seems more annoyed by her husband's arrest than traumatized by her own assault. This is the genius of Remick's choice. She plays Laura not as a victim in the 1950s sense, but as a survivor in the 2020 sense. She's a narcissist. Maybe she's a pragmatist. But she is not the weeping swan the world wants her to be. The film's most explosive, culture-shifting moment, however, comes in the courtroom. It is the scene that, for generations, would define the movie and Remick's career. Laura Mannion is on the witness stand. The prosecutor, a slick, brutal man, is trying to paint her as the tramp he believes her to be. He is trying to prove she's a liar. He asks her with a sneer if she and the man she claims raped her were in fact lovers. He claims he has a witness who found a pair of her panties in the dead man's laundry. And then the moment comes. The prosecutor, his voice dripping with contempt, asks her, "Did you take off your panties?" The courtroom explodes. The judge is apoplectic. This is 1959. You do not say the word panties in a public courtroom, much less a motion picture. The scene is a direct, brutal assault on the very idea of classy discourse. But watch Lee Remick. She is on the stand. She is, for all the world, the classy debutante, the perfect lady from Miss Hewitt's. And she is being forced to discuss in public her underwear. A Grace Kelly character would have fainted. She would have dissolved into tears of classy shame. She would have been, in that moment, a perfect victim. Lee Remick does not faint. She does not dissolve. She looks for a moment humiliated. She looks at the prosecutor and at the all-male jury with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. She doesn't become a victim. She becomes a witness to their hypocrisy, their dirty minds. In that one scene, she takes all the shame the world is trying to heap on her, the shame of her class, the shame of her sexuality, the shame of her assault, and she reflects it back on her attackers. And then, just to complete the performance, Preminger has her do something else. Later in the film, after this traumatic public humiliation, we see her playing jazz piano in a bar, flirting and giggling with her husband's lawyer. What is this? Is she a victim or a sociopath? Is she a brave survivor or a pathological liar? The movie never answers, and that is why it is a masterpiece, and that is why she is a masterpiece. Lee Remick's Laura Manion is arguably the first truly modern female protagonist in a mainstream American film. She is not a good girl or a bad girl. She is not a virgin or a vamp. She is a person, a messy, complicated, unreliable, sexually aware, intelligent, and possibly guilty person. She had taken the Grace Kelly mold, the patrician package, and used it to smuggle a stick of dynamite into the American courthouse. The film was a massive, scandalous blockbuster hit. It was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. Remick, for her part, was nominated for a Golden Globe. She was, at 24 years old, one of the biggest, most important, and most dangerous stars in the world. The second Grace Kelly tag was dead. It was gone. She was now something far more potent and far more limiting. She had created an entirely new box for herself. She was not the cool blonde. She was the hot and cool blonde. She was the classy bad girl. Hollywood, which had been so confused by her, now finally understood her, or at least they thought they did. And in their understanding, they were preparing a new, more sophisticated and far more inescapable cage. In the immediate, blazing aftermath of Anatomy of a Murder, Lee Remick was on top of the world. But she was also living a profound, almost dizzying contradiction. While the world was watching Laura Manion, this party girl, this tramp, this icon of modern, dangerous sexuality, the real Lee Remick was living the most gilded cage life imaginable. In 1957, before her career had truly exploded, she had married Bill Reed, a handsome, successful television producer. It was, on the surface, the perfect match. The debutante had married the successful man. And in 1959, the very same year she was scandalizing the nation with her panties, she gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Kate. This is the crucible. This is the essence of the Swan tragedy, the trap that Truman Capote's women knew so well. It is the demand for public perfection in your private life, a performance that is, in many ways, more exhausting and more debilitating than any role you could ever play on screen. Imagine the psychological whiplash. By day, she is Lee Remick, the perfect 1950s wife and mother. She is, by all accounts, a devoted mother. She is living the suburban dream, the invisible cage that Betty Friedan would soon name and dissect. She is Mrs. Bill Reed. And then she goes to work, where she is Lee Remick, the scandal. She is the classy bad girl. She is, to the public, the embodiment of a new, frighteningly liberated woman. She was, in essence, playing 2 roles, 24 hours a day. And the system was about to show her which role it valued more. Elia Kazan, the man who had discovered her, the man who had seen her fire before anyone else, had not forgotten her. In 1960, he came back to her. He was making a new film, Wild River, This was not a Preminger Scandal film. This was not a hot roll. This was a Kazan roll. This was the method. This was art. She was cast as Carol Garth, a young widow with two small children living in the mud and poverty of the rural Tennessee backwoods in the 1930s. The film was a serious, somber, almost poetic drama about the clash between the old America and the new. The Tennessee Valley Authority has come to build a dam and flood her land, and she must decide whether to stay on the land of her ancestors or move into the 20th century. Let us be clear, this was the anti-Lorimanian. There was no class here, no patrician poise. She was playing a poor, uneducated, desperate, and deeply messy human being. She wasn't wearing tight sweaters. She was in faded, torn house dresses. She wasn't flirting in a bar. She was digging her hands in the mud, weeping for her dead husband, and fighting for her children. This was her Gertrude side, her performer soul, unleashed, with no frank filter. This was arguably her truest self as an actress. This was her chance to prove to the world that she was not a bombshell or a bad girl. She was a serious actor, in the same league as her co-star, the legendary Montgomery Clift. The film was shot. She was, by all accounts, magnificent. She had held her own with Clift. She had given Kazan the raw, wounded, unpretty truth he so famously demanded. And in 1960, Wild River was released. It was a catastrophic, unmitigated financial bomb. Nobody went. The critics were respectful, but confused. The public, who had just lined up in droves to see Laura Manion, had zero interest in seeing her as a mud-stained widow. This was a devastating, career-defining lesson, and it is a lesson that Hollywood teaches with ruthless efficiency to all of its stars, but especially to its women. The lesson was this: when you played the classy bad girl, you got a blockbuster, a Golden Globe nomination, and your face on every magazine. When you played the serious actor, you got an empty theater. The system was speaking, the audience was speaking, and they were all saying the same thing. We don't want your truth, Lee. We want your class. We want your scandal. We want the pretty girl playing dirty. That's the product we'll buy. The cage was snapping shut. Hollywood, now understanding its new product, went right back to the formula. Her next film, Sanctuary, was a complete, almost parody-level typecast. It was an adaptation of a William Faulkner novel. She was cast, once again, as a Southern girl, a good girl from a classy family, who is sexually corrupted and becomes a fallen woman. It was the long, hot summer mixed with anatomy of a murder. It was the classy bad girl in a Southern setting. The film was a mess and it flopped. It was a lazy, cynical attempt to recapture the anatomy lightning, and it proved that the formula was not as simple as it looked. Now Remick was in a dangerous place. The classy bad girl box was already becoming a trap. Anatomy was a hit, but the follow-ups had failed. She was 27 years old. She was a wife. She was a mother of two. And her career, which had been a rocket, was now stalling. She needed a hit. She needed to work. In 1962, a director named Blake Edwards came to her. Edwards was a new kind of director. He was known for style. He was sophisticated, cool, and known for the light, effervescent comedy of Breakfast at Tiffany's. He was in many ways the classy director. He was perfect for her classy brand. He cast her in a thriller called Experiment in Terror. The role was a pure 100% regression to the Grace Kelly mold. It was the Hitchcockian ideal. Remick played Kelly Sherwood, a classy, perfect, respectable bank teller who is stalked by a mysterious asthmatic killer. The killer threatens her and her younger sister. She must spend the whole film being terrorized, scared, and victimized. She was, in essence, the perfect victim. She was brilliant at it. The film is a tight, stylish, and incredibly effective thriller. And it works because She is Lee Remick. The terror is more terrifying because it's happening to this classy, perfect, untouchable woman. It was the same logic that would later be used with devastating effect in 1976's The Omen. The film was a solid hit. Her career was stabilized. She had successfully retreated from the dangerous territory of anatomy in Wild River and found a new, safe box, the classy victim. She was now 27 years old, a mother of 2, and her career path seemed set. She was the classy blonde. She would do thrillers. She would do classy dramas. She would play the sophisticated wife, the perfect victim. She would, in essence, become the second Grace Kelly after all. The Kazan anomaly was over. The fire was out. The gilded cage had won. She was Mrs. Bill Reed at home, and she was the perfect lady on screen. The Frank Remick side of her soul, the patrician ideal, had finally and completely suffocated the Gertrude side, the performer's fire. And then Blake Edwards, the very man who had just locked her in this classy victim box, came back. He had a new project. He was going to direct it. His best friend, Jack Lemmon, was going to star. It was another script, like The Man with the Golden Arm, that Hollywood didn't want to touch. It was a story about a perfect couple, a classy couple who fall in love, get married, and proceed to drink themselves into the absolute ugliest, most non-gilded cage imaginable pit of hell. It was called Days of Wine and Roses. Lemmon was set to play the husband, Joe. They needed his wife, Kirsten. They needed a woman who, like in Anatomy, could be both. She had to be at first the picture of classy, perfect, almost puritanical sobriety. And then she had to descend. She had to become a drunk, a liar, a neglectful mother, a hollowed-out, messy monster. Lemmon, who had worked with Remick, knew she was the one. He knew about the Kazan anomaly. He knew her fire wasn't out, it was just waiting. He and Edwards went to the studio to Warner Brothers and said, "We want Lee Remick." The studio, according to legend, was horrified. Lee Remick? They balked. The classy one? The patrician lady from Experiment in Terror? She's too pretty. She's too perfect. She's Miss Hewitt's. She's a swan. No one on earth will believe her as a disgusting, dirt-smeared, animalistic drunk. They had no idea. They had forgotten. They had forgotten the girl who twirled the baton. Jack Lemmon and Blake Edwards fought for her. They staked their own reputations on it. They knew what the studio didn't, that to truly show the horror of this disease, you couldn't cast a messy actress. You had to cast the most perfect, most classy, most swan-like woman in Hollywood. You had to cast the one person the audience would never believe it could happen to. The studio reluctantly agreed. Lee Remick, the classy victim, the second Grace Kelly, the perfect wife and mother, had just been handed the script that would give her performer soul the weapon it needed to take her patrician cage and blow it into a million unrecognizable pieces. The studio's fear, she's too pretty, she's too perfect, was not just a casting note. It was a cultural diagnosis. It was the voice of the gilded cage itself, the system's reflexive terror of seeing its own ideals defiled. In 1962, America was still just barely clinging to the 1950s. Fantasy alcoholism, especially female alcoholism, was not a disease you discussed in polite company. It was a private matter. It was a moral failing, a symptom of a bad wife or an unfit mother. It was the ultimate messy secret, the kind of thing that Truman Capote's real-life swans would hide behind locked bedroom doors, whispered about by maids, a source of profound private and classy shame. The few times Hollywood had dared to touch it, it was always with a kind of romantic, tragic glamour. It was the sad, misunderstood starlet, drinking herself to death in a silk negligee. Days of Wine and Roses was not that. It was a story conceived in the new, harsh, fluorescent light of 1960s realism. And Blake Edwards and Jack Lemmon understood the brutal, brilliant thesis at its core. To make this story truly terrifying, to make it work, you couldn't cast a messy person. You couldn't cast a tramp or a bombshell. You had to cast the perfect one. You had to cast the one that everyone, the audience, the studio, the culture itself, believed was too classy to fall. The horror, in short, depended entirely on the desecration of the ideal. It depended on Lee Remick. And Lee, the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the classy debutante from Miss Hewitt's, read the script and her Gertrude soul, the performer who had been suffocated by class, the artist who had been rejected in the mud of Wild River, must have screamed in recognition. This was it. This was not a role. It was an exorcism. It was a chance to take the gilded cage and her patrician persona and use them as the ultimate sacrificial weapons. The film begins and we see the perfect Lee Remick, the Lee Remick the studio wanted. Her character, Kirsten Arneson, is not just not a drunk. She is a teetotaler. She is the epitome of the classy, sensible, Frank Remick woman. She's a career secretary, sharp, efficient, and bright. She is, in her own words, a square. And in her first scenes with Jack Lemmon's Joe, a fast-talking, fun PR man, he is the one with the problem. He's the one who needs a drink to get through the day. She is the one who is pure. Then comes the seduction. It is one of the most insidious and brilliant scenes ever filmed. Joe, in love with this perfect girl, cannot abide her perfection. Her class is, to him, a challenge. He needs to loosen her up, to pull her down into his own messy world. He takes her to a bar. She, famously, doesn't drink. She asks for a chocolate-covered cherry. He laughs, and he orders her a brandy Alexander. It's like a milkshake. He coaxes. She sips it, and her reaction is pure, unfiltered truth. She gags. Her entire patrician body, her classy system, rejects the poison. It's disgusting. It's a bad thing. Joe, the charismatic predator, laughs it off, coaxes her, be a sport. And she, the woman trained her whole life to be agreeable, to be the perfect date, takes another sip, and another, and so it begins, not with a bang, but with a milkshake. He, the husband, the man, teaches her how to drink. He, in his desperate need for a fun partner, a party girl, personally and lovingly, pulls her from her gilded cage and shoves her straight into the abyss. What follows is not a performance. It is a dissolution. It is, scene by scene, the most devastating, unglamorized depiction of an ideal being rotted from the inside out. Blake Edwards, the classy director of Breakfast at Tiffany's, shows none of that film's holly-go-lightly glamour. He films Remick's descent with an almost cruel, documentary-style honesty. We watch the Frank Remick exterior literally dissolve. First, it's fun, the perfect couple, now a fun couple, drinking, laughing, staying out late, but the class is already slipping. The witty, sharp Kirsten is replaced by a giggling, slightly messy girl. Then comes the marriage, the child, the invisible cage of the suburbs. And the drinking is no longer fun. It is necessary. We watch Lee Remick, the perfect mother, become the monstrous mother. In one scene, Joe comes home to find their apartment filled with smoke. He runs to the bedroom and there is Lee, passed out, a cigarette burning a hole in the mattress, just inches away from their baby's crib. This is not a tragic drunk. This is not sad glamour. This is ugly. This is negligent. This is unforgivable. And her patrician training, the debutante's poise, it doesn't go away. It mutates. Remick's genius is to show how Kirsten uses her class as a liar's tool. She uses her Miss Hewitt's poise to look a friend in the eye and lie about the bottles. She uses her charm to deflect, to hide, to manipulate. The class is no longer an armor. It's a camouflage. She is, in essence, playing Laura Manion from Anatomy of a Murder all over again. But this time, the lie isn't for a jury, it's for herself. And the crime is not murder, it's survival. The Gertrude soul is finally completely unleashed, but it's not a performance of art, it's a performance of addiction. The fire that Kazan had seen, the fire Hollywood had tried to tame, is now burning the character alive. And then Blake Edwards, Jack Lemmon, and Lee Remick take us to a place that 1962 and arguably 2022 was not prepared to go. The film's climax, Joe, in a moment of alcohol-induced lucidity, has seen the horror. He has, with the help of a sponsor, gotten dry. He has joined Alcoholics Anonymous. He is for the moment sober. Kirsten is not. She is, in his absence, trapped. She is a dry drunk, and her body, her entire being, is screaming. The scene is set. Joe is at an AA meeting, saving himself. Kirsten is alone, in their apartment, imprisoned with her father. She is shaking. She is desperate. She is an animal in a cage. Her father, trying to help, has locked her in. She tears the apartment apart. She rips through closets, drawers, begging him, "Where is it? Where did Joe hide it?" He doesn't know. And then she remembers. A flicker, not of class, not of intelligence, but of pure, junkie instinct, Joe's secret stash. The last resort bottle, buried in the garage, in his hothouse, in a potted plant. She breaks out. She doesn't walk. She runs. She is barefoot. She is in a stained, wrinkled house dress. This is not the patrician Lee Remick. This is not Mrs. Bill Reed. This is not even Laura Manion. This is an it. She gets to the garage, the grimy, dirty hothouse, and she plunges her hands into the potting soil. This is the moment. This is the Wild River mud. This is the messy, unpretty, unclassy truth that the studios had rejected, that the audience had refused to see, and now they are forced to watch. She is not an actress. She is an animal. Digging, clawing, frantic, her perfectly manicured swan hands now just claws, caked in filth. She finds the bottle, her face in that moment. It is not joy. It is not relief. It is a transcendence of horror. She tries to open it, her hands shaking so badly she can't. She smashes the bottle against the concrete. She cuts her hands. She doesn't care. And then she lifts the broken, jagged neck, and then she guzzles the remaining liquor. She is drinking vodka, mixed with potting soil, mixed with her own blood. Her face is smeared with dirt. Her eyes are rolled back. She is, in that moment, a swan that has been dragged from its gilded lake and drowned unequivocally in the mud. This is not acting. This is a confession. This is the performer staging a public execution of the patrician. It is, to this day, one of the most brutal, honest, and un-Hollywood moments ever filmed. It is quite simply one of the greatest pieces of screen acting of the 20th century. The film was released in 1962. It did not land on the American public like a movie, it landed like a verdict. It was not a blockbuster in the Anatomy sense. It did not create a scandal. It induced a trauma. People went to see Jack Lemmon, the beloved comedian, and Lee Remick, the beautiful star, and they walked out shattered, silent, and deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. It was too real. It was too messy. But the performance, nobody, not even the most scandalized critic, could deny the performance, the Kazan. Anomaly was no longer an anomaly. It was a fact. Lee Remick was not a classy blonde. She was not a bombshell. She was perhaps the most honest actress of her generation. The industry, in a collective gasp of awe, had no choice. She was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actress. She was 27 years old, and she was the overwhelming favorite to win. This was it. This was the moment of gilded cage vindication. The moment when the performer would finally, publicly, be given the patrician stamp of approval. The classy debutante who had dared to play in the mud was about to be crowned queen. This was her coronation. Her competition was stiff, but in many ways, it was seen as a race for second place. There was Katharine Hepburn for Long Day's Journey into Night, Betty Davis for Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Geraldine Page for Sweet Bird of Youth, and then there was Anne Bancroft for The Miracle Worker. On the night of the 35th Academy Awards, April 8, 1963, Lee Remick, the perfect wife, the perfect mother, sat in that audience, the perfect picture of a swan at the ball, waiting for her name to be called. The envelope was opened, and the winner was Anne Bancroft. Lee Remick lost. We must pause here. This is not a footnote. This is not Hollywood trivia. This loss is in many ways the climax of her story. It is the moment the indelible, cruel, and true verdict of the gilded cage was handed down. Why did she lose? Let's analyze the winner. Anne Bancroft's performance as Annie Sullivan, the teacher of Helen Keller, was a tour de force. It was capital A acting. It was physical, it was loud, it was theatrical. It was famously a 10-minute scene of her wrestling a child to the ground, trying to teach her to eat with a spoon. But most importantly, Bancroft's role was redemptive. It was a Hollywood story, even if it was a gritty one. It was a story about triumph. It was about saving someone. It was about the triumph of the human spirit. It was a performance that, when you finished watching it, made you feel good. It made you feel inspired. Now look at Remick's performance. It was not theatrical. It was anti-theatrical. It was too real. It was internal. It was ugly. It was quiet. It was unpretty. And most importantly, it was not redemptive. The final devastating anti-Hollywood statement of Days of Wine and Roses is the ending. Joe, the husband, gets sober. He finds redemption. He triumphs. Kirsten doesn't. In the film's final soul-crushing scene, she shows up at his apartment. He is clean, sober, rebuilding his life with his daughter. He begs her, "Come in, join us. You can do it." And she looks at him, the fire now just a dead, hollow ash, and she says, "I don't want to." She doesn't know herself, she says, without the bottle. And she turns, and she walks away back into the shadows, back into the mess. She is not saved. The Academy and the audience had been shown two performances. One was a triumphant story of saving someone. The other was a defeatist story of losing someone. Hollywood, in the end, did what Hollywood always does. It admires the truth, but it rewards the fantasy. It respects the mess, but it gives the golden statue to the triumph. Remick's performance was not a performance. It was a mirror, and it was a mirror that showed the gilded cage its own ugly swan reflection, that sometimes the perfect ones don't want to be saved, that sometimes the mess wins, that sometimes the patrician ideal is a lie, and the fire underneath is just self-destruction. It was too much. It was too real. She had, in effect, done exactly what the studio had feared. She had been so perfect at being imperfect that she had broken the fantasy, and the system, in its moment of judgment, punished her for it. The Oscar loss was more than a disappointment. It was a verdict. It was the system, the gilded cage itself, delivering a clear, unmistakable message, a message that echoed the Wild River failure, but now 100 times louder. We see your Gertrude fire. We see your performer soul. We see your mud. We admire it. We will nominate it, but we will not reward it. It is too much. It is unpretty. It is uninspiring. Go back to being the swan. Go back to being classy. A different kind of actress, a method actress like Kim Stanley, perhaps might have doubled down. She might have gone off Broadway, or started seeking out only the messy roles in a defiant gesture to the system. But Lee Remick was not Kim Stanley. At her core, she was still the debutante, the perfect wife, the woman who had been trained her whole life to keep things tidy, That wild greenhouse rebellion inside her had been glorious. And it had failed. It hadn't won the polite approval it so desperately craved. And so the polished, well-behaved version of herself took back control. If the world was going to punish her for being messy, then she would, quite simply, stop being messy. Her career, in the immediate aftermath of Days of Wine and Roses, is a portrait of a strategic, almost psychological retreat. She did The Running Man, a classy Hitchcock-style thriller, a cat and mouse game in Europe. She was classy. She did The Wheeler Dealers, a classy, witty, romantic comedy with James Garner. She was classy. She did Baby the Rain Must Fall, a classy drama with Steve McQueen. She did The Hallelujah Trail, a big, classy Western comedy. Where was the fire? Where was the mud? It was gone. She was still working. She was still a star. But she was now officially safe. She was Lee Remick, the classy actress. The Kazan anomaly was over. The Days of Wine and Roses girl was a memory, a brave thing she did once and in her personal life. The gilded cage was becoming just as managed. Her perfect marriage to Bill Reed, the one that had been the backdrop to her entire meteoric rise, was cracking. We do not know the private matters. Lee Remick, as always, was a swan. She did not make a scene, she did not talk, but in 1968 the perfect marriage was quietly, civilly, and classily dissolved divorce. Again, no mess, no scandal. It was all handled with patrician grace. This was a turning point. She was now 33 years old, a single mother of 2. Her career, which had been defined by her class, was now in safe mode. The 1960s were raging. Bonnie and Clyde, the graduate easy rider, and Lee Remick, the classy one, was suddenly not relevant to the new, messy Hollywood. She was in a dangerous, liminal space. The gilded cage she had outgrown was being replaced by a new Hollywood that had no use for her. She was, in effect, an exile. And then she did what so many exiles, from Henry James to T.S. Eliot, have done. She moved to London. This move in 1969/1970 is the single most important decision of the second half of her life. It is the moment she, quite literally, trades one gilded cage for another. She had met a British producer, William Kip Gowans. He was, by all accounts, a dashing, classy man, an English gentleman. She fell in love. She married him in 1970. And she moved with her children to England. She essentially left Hollywood. This was not a retirement. It was a rebranding, a transference. If Hollywood, the messy new Hollywood, had no use for her class, she would go to the one place on earth where class was still the ultimate currency, England. The part of her that prized stability and respectability hadn't just won the war. It had moved the entire army to a new, more favorable battlefield. And in London, Lee Remick was not just an actress, she was royalty. When Lee Remick arrived in England, it was not as an exile, but as a conquering hero. The British press and public, who had always maintained a slight suspicion of Hollywood's raw populist energy, saw her as one of their own. She was not a movie star, that vulgar American invention. She was an actress. She was the woman who had gone toe-to-toe with James Stewart. She was the Oscar nominee. She was, in a word, classy. She became, almost overnight, Princess Grace of London. She was the American star who had chosen them, who had validated their cultural superiority over the messy, newfangled Hollywood. She was the toast of the West End theater scene, taking on challenging, sophisticated stage roles that her film career was no longer offering. She was witty, she was sophisticated, she was elegant. She was, in every sense of the word, the perfect swan for her new patrician English pond. It felt like a final triumphant victory for the part of her that had always wanted to be perfectly composed. She had found a world that not only accepted that polished image, but celebrated and rewarded it. And this new, adoring world offered her a new kingdom. It was not film. By the 1970s, New Hollywood was in full gritty swing. The era of The Godfather, Mean Streets, and The French Connection had no place for a cool patrician blonde, unless she was a victim or a ghost. Her new kingdom was television. But this was not the boob tube of 1960s America. This was the era of the event. This was the birth of the miniseries. In the 1970s, the miniseries was the most prestigious, most classy, most literary form of popular entertainment in the world. It was where the real acting was happening, the real drama. It was the medium for I, Claudius, for Upstairs, Downstairs, for Brideshead Revisited. It was, in effect, a new televised gilded cage, and Lee Remick became its undisputed queen. Her coronation was the 1974 BBC production, Jenny, Lady Randolph Churchill. The casting was not just perfect, it was prophetic. She was playing Jenny, a brilliant, beautiful, and fast American heiress who comes to England, marries into the high Victorian aristocracy, and scandalizes them all with her intelligence, her wit, and her American fire. She was the woman who would, of course, give birth to Winston Churchill. It was, quite literally, the exact parallel of Remick's own life. The American patrician who conquered the British aristocracy. It was the ultimate synthesis of her brand. She got to be both the American firebrand and the British aristocrat. She was classy, but she was also dangerous. She was perfect, but she was also scandalous. It was anatomy of a murder, but wrapped in a classy prestige BBC package. The reception was ecstatic. She was magnificent. She was Jenny, and the British, unlike the Americans, rewarded her for it. She won the BAFTA for Best Actress. The message was clear. The Oscar loss, the Days of Wine and Roses failure, was now, in her mind, explained Hollywood had punished her for her mud. The British, in their wisdom, rewarded her for her class. The retreat was complete. The gilded cage of London was now her fortress. She was, of course, still a movie star, and in 1976 she made her biggest, most commercially successful film ever. A film that once again proved the central tragic thesis of her brand. The film was the Omen. The casting is again a work of cynical genius. She was cast as Catherine Thorne, the wife of the American ambassador to Great Britain. A perfect, loving, and impossibly classy mother, she is, in short, the perfect swan. And the entire terrifying power of that film hinges on the desecration of that swan. She is the mother of the Antichrist, Damien. The film's horror works because she is Lee Remick. The terror is more terrifying because it's happening to her. This perfect, untouchable patrician woman. We watch in horror as this gilded cage ideal is attacked, brutalized, and ultimately murdered. Her death scene, being thrown from a hospital window, crashing through the roof of an ambulance, is iconic. Why? Because it's the ultimate violation. The system loved watching its classy ideal get messy in the most violent way possible. It was the experiment in terror logic perfected. The film was a global blockbuster hit. It cemented her in the public's mind as the ultimate classy victim. For the rest of the 1970s and 1980s, she ruled her kingdom. She was unequivocally the queen of the miniseries. Ike, The War Years, The Blue Knight, Wheels, Haywire, Jenny. These were not TV movies, they were events. And she was the classy face of all of them. She was, by all accounts, happy. She loved her life in London. She loved her husband, Kip Gowans. She loved her work. She was respected. She was beloved. She had, in her mind, escaped the Hollywood trap. She famously said in an interview, "Thank God I'm not a star. I'm an actress. Stars are in a different, awful category. I think of them as dead. You have to be dead to be a star." What a tragic, prophetic, and deeply insightful thing to say. She truly believed it. She believed that by trading the messy Hollywood film world for the classy London television world, she had beaten the system. She had avoided the awful category of the star and settled into the respectable life of the working actress. She had, in her mind, found a way to be both Frank and Gertrude. She was the perfect swan who also got to work. She had no idea. She had not escaped the cage. She had just redecorated it. She had not avoided the awful category. She had just become the perfect, classy face of it. The industry that had first packaged her hadn't truly let her go. It had not forgiven her for days of wine and roses. It was just waiting. It was waiting, as it always does with its swans, for the one thing that perfection cannot hide: the crack. For nearly 2 decades, the gilded cage of London served Lee Remick perfectly. It was, in fact, more than a cage. It was a fortress. From her new classy perch in England, she had successfully performed the greatest magic trick of her career. She had made her own messy, failed Hollywood past disappear. The 1980s dawned, and Lee Remick was the living, breathing embodiment of having it all. She was by now an institution, a transatlantic treasure. She was still luminous, her patrician beauty mellowing into a sophisticated, intelligent grace that only added to her classy brand. She was happily married to her English gentleman, Kip Gowans. Her children, Kate and Matt, were grown and successful. She was, in every measurable way, a success. More importantly, she was a working actress. This distinction, which she had made so pointedly, "Thank God I'm not a star, I'm an actress," had become her life's motto. It was the central pillar of her new perfect identity. Stars, in her mind, were the awful category. They were the Hollywood tragedies. They were the Marilyn Monroes, the Judy Garlands, the messy, unclassy women who had been eaten alive by the system. They were the ones who had failed to manage their lives, who had let their Gertrude fire burn them alive. She, on the other hand, had won. She had used her Gertrude fire to build a respectable, classy career in television, the one medium that rewarded her patrician grace. She was not a star. She was an actress. This performance of control was, by the late 1980s, her greatest role. She had avoided the mess of Hollywood. She had avoided the mess of a scandalous divorce. She had avoided the mess of a stalled career. She was the one swan who had, seemingly, learned to fly. She had become the ultimate Frank Remick ideal, fully realized. A perfect woman, living a perfect life with all the messy parts safely locked away in the prestige vault of her past. She had, in her mind, beaten the gilded cage. She had forgotten the fundamental, cruelest rule of the gilded cage. The system that builds its icons on the impossible ideal of perfection does not ever let them go. It needs them to fail. It is, in fact, obsessed with their failure. The tragedy of Truman Capote's real-life swans was that they were, in the end, destroyed by social cracks. They were betrayed by their husbands. They were exiled for their own gossip. They were undone by aging, by the simple, unclassy crime of no longer being perfect to look at. Their destruction was external. Lee Remick's destruction would be far more profound, far more modern, and far more real. The crack, when it came, would not be social, it would be cellular. In 1989, Lee Remick was in France. She was, as always, working. She was starring in a television movie called Bridge to Silence. She was 53 years old, still luminous, still at the absolute peak of her classy prestige powers. The role was, as usual, a classy one. She was playing the mother of a deaf-mute woman. It was a story of dignified struggle. During the shoot, she felt a pain in her hand, a persistent, annoying ache. Then she noticed some small lumps on her body. This was a messy detail, a private matter, a bother. She was Lee Remick. She was a professional. She had a schedule. She did not make a scene. She finished the film. When she returned home, she went to a doctor. The diagnosis was not classy. It was not poetic. It was not tragic in the Hollywood sense. It was the ugliest, messiest, most uninspiring word in the English language. Cancer. It was not a warning. It was a death sentence. She had kidney cancer. It was aggressive. And it had, in the time she was classily finishing her film, already metastasized. It was in her lungs. We must stop here. We must understand what this meant to her. This was not just a medical diagnosis. This was a psychological detonation. This was Lee Remick, the perfect one, the classy one, the swan who was defined by her grace, her poise, her control, and now her own body. Her perfect patrician shell had betrayed her. It had produced an unclassy, rebellious, messy thing that was quite literally eating her alive from the inside out. This was Days of Wine and Roses. But it was not a movie. This was the greenhouse. This was the mud. But it was not potting soil. It was her own cells. And how does a swan react to this? How does a woman whose entire life has been a performance of class and control and not making a scene react to the ultimate unclassy, messy scene? She reacts in the only way her Frank Remick soul knows how. She tells no one. This is the key. This is the most critical, most heartbreaking, and most swan-like decision of her life. She told her husband, Kip. She told her children, Kate and Matt. She told her absolute most trusted inner circle friends, but she did not tell the public. She did not tell the industry. She began grueling experimental treatments, chemotherapy, radiation, the ugly work. And she did it all in secret. Why? Because her entire identity was now at stake. Because in her patrician mind, cancer was not a disease. It was a weakness. It was not classy. It was messy. It was ugly. It was pitiful. She was Lee Remick, the perfect one. She was the one who had escaped the awful category of the dead star. And what was this if not the ultimate symbol of that awful category? She was in her mind protecting the perfect ideal of Lee Remick. She was protecting her brand. She would not allow the world to see the mud this time. Not the metaphorical mud of Days of Wine and Roses, which they had punished her for, but the real mud of human frailty, which they would, in her mind, be even more repulsed by. She was Lee Remick, the classy one, and she would, she decided, die with class. But she was also Lee Remick, the actress. She was Gertrude's daughter. And so, in the face of this death sentence, she did the most performer thing imaginable. She denied it. She continued to work. This is the final devastating and most method performance of her life. She knew she was dying, and she still accepted roles. She flew to Turkey to star in a TV movie called Dark Holiday. The irony is almost too cruel, too Hollywood, to be real. She played an American tourist who is falsely imprisoned in a brutal, nightmarish Turkish jail. She is a classy woman trapped, her perfect life gone, her body at the mercy of a diseased and corrupt system she cannot control. It was not a metaphor, it was a documentary. She was, quite literally, playing her own life. She was imprisoned in her own body. She was a victim while pretending to be a victim. How she got through the filming, we can only imagine. The patrician side, her classy professionalism, pushing her performer soul through the grueling days, all while her actual messy, unclassy, cancerous body was, quite literally, failing her. This was her final, most heartbreaking performance, playing healthy, playing Lee Remick. For 2 years, she lived this double life. She was the swan, gracefully gliding on the surface of her London life, all while, underneath, her cellular feet were paddling with a desperate, dying, messy fury. The gilded cage of her class, the patrician ideal, had become her final prison. It had trapped her in a performance of silence. But the system, the Hollywood system, does not allow for silence. The gilded cage, the machine that builds its swans, demands its final act. It must have its mess. It must have its tragedy. The system that builds you must be there to watch you fall. It is part of the narrative. It is the price of the gilded cage. The crack which Lee had so classily hidden must be shown. And in the spring of 1991, the system which had forgotten her for 20 years, the messy Hollywood she had fled, called. It was the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce. In a fit of sudden, convenient, and perfectly timed memory, they had decided it was time Lee Remick, the classy exile, the queen of the miniseries, the second Grace Kelly, was finally going to get her star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. This wasn't just an honor. It was Hollywood reclaiming her story for itself. It was calling its swan home for one last public and final performance. The invitation, when it came, was not an honor. It was a summons. The Hollywood gilded cage, the system she had so pointedly and publicly fled 20 years prior, had spoken. It was, on its surface, a wonderful gesture, a long overdue recognition. Lee Remick is getting her star. The star system, which she had so correctly identified as the awful category of the dead, was simply claiming its next victim. It had heard the whispers. It knew the swan was cracked, and a cracked swan is the most valuable swan of all. For Lee, in her London fortress, this summons must have been a psychological crisis. The patrician side of her, the side that had built her entire identity on class, control, and privacy, must have been horrified. To go now, like this, to appear in front of the world, not as the luminous Lee Remick, not as the perfect swan, but as a patient, an invalid. It was the ultimate violation of her class. It was, in a word, messy. But the performer side, the actress who, even while dying, still said yes to Dark Holiday, that side knew the rule. You show up, the show must go on. Perhaps in her mind she could control this narrative. She could manage this too. She could go, accept the honor with grace, and prove, one last time, that she was still Lee Remick. She was wrong. She was not in control. She was, for the first time, the script. And the script was a tragedy. On April 18, 1991, Lee Remick, who had been in classy seclusion for months, showed up. The location was 6161 Hollywood Boulevard, the heart of the machine. The footage of this day is perhaps the single most heartbreaking and most honest performance of her life. It is the final unwatchable scene of Days of Wine and Roses. This was not Lee Remick, the star. This was not the classy, perfect swan. This was a 55-year-old woman being consumed. The cellular betrayal was no longer a private matter. It was a public fact. She was in a wheelchair, her body ravaged by 2 years of experimental chemotherapy and radiation, was a messy, unclassy testament to the truth. Her beautiful patrician face was puffy and swollen from steroids. Her famous luminous blonde hair, the swan plumage, was thin, brittle, and lifeless. The gilded cage had, in its most brutal act, stripped her of her classy armor. The Frank Remick ideal was gone, destroyed, and all that was left was the Gertrude soul, the mud of Wild River, the filth of the greenhouse, the human. The star system, of course, was ecstatic. This was cinema. This was tragedy. This was better than a movie. Hollywood was there in force. Not the new Hollywood of gritty rebels, but the old Hollywood, the gilded cage itself, the classy Hollywood. Gregory Peck was there, her husband from the Omen, the ultimate patrician figure. Robert Stack was there, Tony Franciosa, Angie Dickinson. They were all there, the Swans and their squires, gathering for the public, classy funeral of one of their own. And they all, as the system demanded, performed. They gave beautiful weeping speeches. They talked of her luminosity, her talent, her grace, her class. They were, in effect, narrating her perfect obituary, all while she was sitting right there, her imperfect, messy, living body a silent, screaming rebuke to every classy lie they told. And then the system played its trump card. It sent out the one man who, in this narrative, represented the truth she had once dared to tell Jack Lemmon, her partner from Days of Wine and Roses, the Joe to her Kirsten, the only other person in that crowd who had, with her, gone into the mud, into the greenhouse lemon, his own face a mask of pure, unfiltered, unclassy grief, could not perform the Hollywood script. He could not just read the lines. He approached her wheelchair. He knelt down. This was not Hollywood. This was human. He was not an icon speaking to an icon. He was a man, speaking to the woman he loved, the friend he was losing his voice. Famously comedic, now broke, with a messy thud of real pain. "I have a confession to make," he said, his words catching, his eyes locked on hers. "I have loved you, truly loved you, for 30 years. This was not in the script. This was truth. This was the wild river kind of truth." And Lee, in her wheelchair, Kirsten, the swan in the mud, rallied for her final patrician performance. She looked at him, and in her eyes we can see it, the anatomy of a murder spark, the Laura Manian knowingness. She knew what this was. She knew what performance this was. She was not a victim, not even now. She smiled. That smile, the classy one, the controlled one, and her voice now a thin, frail whisper, but still hers, still patrician. She said, "Oh, Jack, you're such a fool." What a line, what an exit line. It was, in that one moment, the entire war of her life. His messy Gertrude truth met by her classy, frank control. She was, to the very, very end, managing the mess. She was classily deflecting the unclassy, raw emotion she was in her dying breath. Still the swan. Still the perfect debutante from Miss Hewitt's, who knew instinctively that one must not make a scene. The ceremony ended. The system had what it needed. The star was unveiled. The cameras flashed. The Hollywood ending was secured. They had their story. They had their brave, tragic swan. They had their Days of Wine and Roses ending, but this time it was classy. It was an Oscar performance. They had, in effect, murdered the actress and canonized the star. And the star, as she herself had prophesied, was dead. Lee Remick died less than 3 months later, on July 2nd, 1991, at her home in Los Angeles. The performance finally, quietly, and classily stopped. She was 55 years old. The obituaries were exactly what the Walk of Fame ceremony had been designed to produce. They were respectful. They were kind. They were perfect. They called her luminous. They called her versatile. They called her elegant. They called her graceful. And over they called her a class act. And then silence. A profound, deep, and almost immediate cultural silence. This is the great final tragedy of Lee Remick. This is the argument. Her death did not spark a Maryland cult. It did not create a Judy legend. It did not even for a moment inspire the kind of new Hollywood cultural reappraisal that Days of Wine and Roses should have, by all rights, demanded. Her name, her work, her fire just faded. How? How does this happen? How does a star of this magnitude, an Oscar nominee, a BAFTA winner, a 2-time Golden Globe winner, a woman who gave us A Face in the Crowd, Anatomy of a Murder, and Days of Wine and Roses? How does she just vanish from the cultural conversation? The prompt for this story suggested that the world was too tired to love her again. That is the heart of it. That is the truth of the gilded cage. Let's dissect this forgetting. This was not an accident. It was a choice. It was the system's final, brutal, classy act of erasure. Argument 1, the obsolete theory. By moving to London, by becoming the queen of the miniseries, Lee Remick had, with surgical precision, removed herself from the great American film conversation. She had won the battle but lost the war. While the 1970s and 80s raged with her Gertrude soul, The Godfather, Chinatown, Taxi Driver, Terms of Endearment, Lee Remick was, by choice, on the sidelines. She was in classy patrician British drawing rooms. The new American icons were her messy sisters. Diane Keaton, Sissy Spacek, Meryl Streep, Jessica Lange. When Lee Remick died in 1991, she wasn't seen as a contemporary. She was seen as a prestige artifact from a different era. She was, in the new Hollywood mind, already a swan from a bygone age. Argument 2, the typecast theory. The second Grace Kelly tag, the classy brand she had both fought and embraced, had in the end worked. It had worked too well. She had, in her London years, so successfully rebranded herself as the patrician ideal, as Lady Randolph Churchill, as the ambassador's wife in the Omen, that is what the culture remembered the anatomy of a murder girl, the Days of Wine and Roses girl. That girl was the anomaly. The classy lady was the truth. The system, in its lazy typecasting mind, had to forget the mud. It had to forget the fire. Why? Because they didn't fit the brand. Her messy masterpieces were, in the final analysis, bad for business. They confused the gilded cage narrative. It was easier, cleaner, and more classy to remember her as elegant and nothing else. Argument 3, the Capote's swan theory. This is the most unclassy and therefore the most true argument Hollywood and the gilded cage loves a tragedy, but it demands a specific kind of tragedy. It demands a glamorous tragedy. It wants the glamour of Marilyn Monroe. It wants the glamour of Judy Garland. It wants the glamour of James Dean. It wants a mess that is in itself a form of entertainment, a mess that can be packaged, sold, and turned into a legend. Lee Remick's tragedy was not glamorous. It was real. It was cancer. It was a middle-aged woman fighting a disease that millions of ordinary, unclassy, non-famous people fight and lose to every single day. It was not a Hollywood story. It was a human story. And the system, the gilded cage, has no use for that. It's too real. It's too messy in the wrong way. It's a reminder not of glamorous self-destruction, but of our own random, unfair, unglamorous mortality. The Walk of Fame ceremony was the one and only way the system could handle this. It had to turn her real, ugly tragedy into a classy Hollywood performative tragedy. It was a brave, tragic swan, performing her classy death. And the moment she actually died, the performance was over. The messy, real body was gone. And the system, having gotten its one classy, tragic scene, looked away. It had its final tragic photo op. It shed its tears, and then it immediately moved on, looking for the next new, perfect, uncracked face. She was the ultimate swan, a woman built and celebrated for her perfection. And when that perfection was taken from her, not by glamorous booze or pills, not by a scandalous betrayal, but by a random, unsexy, unmarketable disease, the system erased her. It erased her because her messy truth was, in the end, too real to be classy.